selenium, very, very important.
Yes, very important. I guess pretty much the entire east coast of the South Island anyway, and a large proportion of the eastern areas of the North Island as well, traditionally very selenium deficient. And I guess anyone who's had much to do with rural escapades with livestock of any sort have probably heard about selenium, the metal of selenium anyway. So causes major production problems, and as with all these trace element issues, I always harp on about the analogy with the iceberg, with the hidden costs of trace element deficiency being massive before we actually get any indication of that. So I guess that's the real crux of monitoring these trace element levels through various mechanisms. I mentioned last time about monitoring copper levels with liver biopsies or liver samples through the slaughterhouses and freezing works, and that same modality can be used for selenium as well. But we can also sample with blood sampling, so we can get a sample of animals out of a mob and draw blood, and that will give us a good indication of selenium status as well.
It used to be known in the old days as bush sickness, didn't it, right at the very beginning?
That was cobalt, so we can, we'll talk about that probably in maybe next time actually. So selenium, traditionally the real problems we see with selenium almost give us an inference of problems rather than a direct relationship, and so we see things such as retained fetal membrane, so retained afterbirth in cattle that fail to get rid of their afterbirth after calving, and there's serious implications about fertility issues. So we think that selenium deficiency results in early embryonic death. So for instance, even when the pregnancy is very early, being lost, and we end up with either a barren animal, an animal that we thought was pregnant, and not carrying a calf or some reproduction products, and all of a sudden, we think they're pregnant and they're not, or perhaps they come back into season at a really obscure time after they've lost an early pregnancy. So big economic costs reproductively with selenium issues. Yeah.
A lot of old timers would suggest that they take a spoonful or teaspoonful every morning. Should we?
Potentially, yes, because I guess if we're eating or consuming products that are grown in deficient areas, potentially that could be an issue. Far be it from me to advise that, because it is a toxic element. It's a metal, and so it can be toxic. And every year we do see the scenarios where we're getting toxicities. In horses particularly, we see people that over supplement, and that could also be the case with getting the amount of selenium added to drench wrong. In the old days, that used to kill lots and lots of sheep, and it was a terrible error when in one decimal place was wrong in the amount of selenium that was added to drench and things like that. But the same can be said for animals that are already being supplemented, perhaps through pasture treatment, through fertiliser, and then on top of that they're given injectable products. These could result in toxicity. Horses are classic. We end up with horrible problems with feet falling off, with hooves falling off,
because of excess.
Because people think that a little is good, so a lot must be better, and that, I guess, is the old Kiwi adage, which doesn't actually go hand in hand with when it comes to trace elements.
So it's not like a trifle. The more sherry you put in, the better it is.
Well, no, not quite. Might seem better, but maybe it might be the actions later on that are the problem.
Let's recap on administering, because you gave me 2 or 3 different versions there.
Yep, so supplementation can come in a number of ways. Oral supplementation is fine, and often that's accomplished in the production sense by selenium prills being added to fertiliser, as I mentioned, and that uptaken very well into the grass, into the plant, and then eaten by the animal. But in horses particularly, many people will just drench weekly or monthly. It's a cumulative element, and so you could perhaps give a month's worth of supplementation once a month, or you could split that down and give that weekly, for instance. Dairy farmers often will be akin to using dosatrons and giving soluble levels of the element through water, and that's fine as well. does require a bit of monitoring to make sure that things are not being over or under supplemented, because it is one of these elements that can be toxic before you know it. And we have both chronic toxicities that establish over long periods of time as well as acute. So again, a very important scenario to use some good advice in conjunction with supplementation. So veterinary advice, and to be honest, it's something we would see as vets as an integral part of an animal health plan, that we would invoke monitoring systems through at various times of the year to ensure that supplementation levels are right, and give advice on how else to do that.
So it is seasonal.
Can be seasonal. I guess the effects, as I mentioned with the reproductive issues, the effects of selenium deficiency often will come about and be showing up in a seasonal fashion during the calving season, for instance, in particular, or mating season, when we're getting apparent failures of pregnancies through mating.
So I guess one of the things you need to look at very closely is if you got it in the fertiliser, and so you're going to have to keep monitoring with those blood tests, aren't you?
Absolutely. So yeah, or maybe when we're culling animals through works, or perhaps again if we're monitoring other trace elements such as copper, we can add that in to a panel when we're looking at liver biopsies and things. But yeah, absolutely. And if at a critical time we're a little bit on the low side, perhaps just before mating or a few weeks before mating, despite supplementation methods that are already in place, it may be pertinent that I, for instance, may give advice, well, just before mating or a month before mating, we'll use an injectable product to boost selenium levels during this period.
And that's for the fertility side?
Absolutely, yeah.
What are the visual signs if there's a problem?
Yeah, as I indicated, with selenium in particular, we get overt visual signs of toxicity, we get skin problems and hoof problems, and really ill animals actually with acute poisoning, and sudden deaths were very, very traditionally very apparent in the sheep sector.
Yeah, that's a bit of a hint that something's gone wrong.
Yeah, and very, very acutely. But when we look at deficiency, again, it's a little bit hidden, and it's mainly production limiting issues. So if we've got a large number of retained fetal membranes in a dairy herd, for instance, that may be an indication to just check that things are okay in regards to selenium. If we're having really abnormal returns to season from animals that we think look like they'd held to an insemination, and then they've sort of come back and shown signs of heat or season at an obscure time through their cyclicity, then that would maybe an indication that we've lost embryos early. Or again, if people are practicing early scanning in the dairy region, and they're getting pregnancies scanned and diagnosed very early, and then we get an animal a month or so later that seems to be bulling, or a large number of animals, that could be an indication that that pregnancy's been lost. And if there's if those numbers are actually getting to a concerning level in regards to how your advisor is expecting things to go, then that may be a trigger to check selenium.
Brilliant, Nick. Thank you very much indeed.